Hello and welcome to presentation 3 of 3 for the volunteer training of 2019. As stated in previous presentations, unless you are a new volunteer next year, only renewal of forms and annual gathering will be required of you, because this year we're going a little bit more in depth, so thank you for your cooperation and understanding. In this presentation, we will be reviewing the child protection policy together, along with further resources you can start with to help educate yourself more on this issue, but also the prevention of it in our congregation. My name is Dana Trish, Director of Youth and Christian Education at Shreve United Methodist Church, and let's talk about why we need a child protection policy and what our role is in it. Why does our church need a child protection policy? In a moment, we will be looking at the overwhelming statistics that prove there is not only an issue of child abuse within our nation, but that this issue is not excluded from our church. But as Christians, we have a legal responsibility as a religious organization that is in constant contact with families to provide guidelines on how we protect them. We also have a moral responsibility to have a child protection policy, as we are called to love and care for others, especially children. And spiritually, we need a CPP as it provides a proper guide on how to healthily interact with those we are raising as disciples. In fact, there are a couple Bible verses I can think of that relate to this issue. Mark 10 verses 14 through 15 says, "Let the children come to me, do not hinder them. For to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it." Luke 17 verses 1 through 2 says, "Things that cause people to sin are bound to come, but woe to that person through who they come. It would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around his neck than for him to cause one of these little ones to sin." And Proverbs 31:8 I think is the most powerful. "Speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves." We need protection of not only the church, but those who enter its doors, and the procedures listed in the CPP allow us to decrease the chance of offenders becoming part of our ministry team. It also allows us to deal with all the affected parties with compassion and dignity in the event of an incident, so that grace may resound in our actions. Your part, then, is that after this presentation, to fill out the compliance form and uphold your role as a mandated reporter. More on that later. The renewal cycle for this form is about 2 years. And as you will see in our covenant application form, we are also requiring a background check of you. You can do this again through that attached form in the volunteer application covenant form. Now let's briefly talk about statistics. I want to make clear the severity of the issue, but please don't feel hopeless because the CPP is just one step out of many that we have to prevent the hurt ever coming to our community. Let's go ahead and look at the statistics of abuse on minors. Child abuse happens across all socioeconomic, educational levels, religions, ethnic, and cultural groups. And there have been child abuse reports involving 7.4 million children worldwide. And that's just the reports that are turned in. 74.8% of these victims are neglected, 18.2% physically abused, 8.5% of them sexually abused, and 6.9% of them are psychologically maltreated. And the youngest children are the most vulnerable to maltreatment. In all 52 states of the U.S., it was reported that most victims were younger than 3 years old, and that the rate was highest for children under the year of 1. But like I said before, this issue is not excluded from the church. This is a humanity issue. These statistics help us determine the best procedures to help make and follow to help our congregation decrease the likelihood of any incidents in our community. And it also gives us a way to pray for those who are hurting for the gospel, to speak truth to those who are offenders. Let's look at some of the abuse statistics within the church alone. 3 key reasons why religious leaders have the strong potential to engage in sexual abuse is because of the power of access, not being under surveillance of others, and the power over congregants by being privy to personal knowledge. Some of those other factors would include that others ignore the warning signs. There's this niceness culture of the church that discounts some of the things for friendliness. The ease of private communications, again, no oversight. Having someone with multiple roles, and that there's this inherent trust in the sanctuary where we may not even think about it because we just inherently trust everybody in the sanctuary. Unfortunately, the third most frequent offender is that of a youth volunteer, because these individuals may be more likely to have originally sought a position because they have more unguarded access to a child. So at the end of this presentation, you'll see the beginning of a list of resources that I personally recommend for those who like to further research this issue, but then how we as a church can help families address the issue of child abuse. But you'll see that not only are we addressing the different types of abuse that could happen within our church and our nation, we're also addressing how to prevent our religious leaders and volunteers be put in a place where they can do that abuse in our child protection policy. So let's go ahead and turn to page 1 and we'll get started there. Please note that I'm not going to be reading this word for word. Please do so on your own before you sign the compliance form. And on this first page, we're going to find the purpose and objectives of the child protection policy, along with a list of definitions described in Ohio law of what it means to have child abuse. This document was revised in 2010 November, and this revision period is still current. So the purpose of the child protection policy for our church is to provide procedures to protect all the parties, to establish appropriate responses when there is an incident, and to be a compassionate ministry to all who are involved. And because of that, we have a couple of objectives. The first one is to safeguard the children and youth of our church from abuse and neglect. The very first one. The next one is to respond to all allegations fairly, and the third is to protect staff and volunteers from false allegations. The fourth, to limit church legal risk and liability, and the fifth, in general, just to strengthen the Christian education ministry of children and youth. As we go further down the page on page 1, we're going to see several definitions of what it means when someone says child abuse. It includes acts of sexual activity, endangerment, denial of health as a means of punishment, restraining a child, administering prescription drugs without approval, providing alcohol or controlled substances, commission of an act that results in injury or death of a child, and the infliction of physical or mental injury to a child. Now on to page 2. We have a prevention procedure before hiring or recruiting someone, along with one of the major rules, the 2-adult rule, listed out on page 2. So all those things we talked about the increase of likelihood of abuse in the church, and also the percentages of abuse of children worldwide or nationwide. These 4 steps are simple but effective ways that we can help decrease the likelihood of an offender coming onto the ministry team. This is what the church promises to do to help decrease that likelihood. First one, the 6-month rule. So whether you're a church member or not, every volunteer working with children and youth under the age of 18 should be an active participant in the church for at least 6 months. The reason it's 6 months is because most statistics show that offenders want only easy targets, and the 6-month rule makes it less of an easy target. 1 is the application form. 3 are interviews. Interviews in the application form are required of those we hire as staff, but when we do volunteers, that is kind of already taken care of in the application covenant form. Any further interviews could happen in person with volunteers, but rarely do. And step 4 then is that anyone who has been previously convicted or pled guilty or no contest to a crime against a minor will not be placed in any position involving access to children or youth. And that's a hard and fast rule, and that's also why we require the background checks. So at the very bottom of page 2, we have probably one of the most important rules that you should remember from child protection policy. It's this 2-adult rule, that all activities involving children and youth will be supervised by at least 2 people who are at least 18 years of age and at least 5 years older than those they are supervising. Most child protection policies in churches have this rule, so if you haven't heard it before, you're going to hear it again and again, not only at this church but other churches as well. When it comes to youth volunteers, like if a youth goes to help out with explorers during the church service, as long as they are at least 4 grades ahead, that's kind of the unofficial guideline that I'm using. But let's also talk about the 2-adult rule, in particular classroom settings versus non-classroom settings. So it's preferable that there's always 2 adults, but in cases where only 1 adult can be present for some reason or another, emergency, someone got sick, whatever it may be, other adults need to be in close proximity, which is why all our Sunday school classes are so close together. They're all in that one central area, and we just ask that you keep the door open. A designated person should be aware of the whereabouts of the children and youth whereabouts if they leave the classroom area. So if a child needs to go to the restroom, or you send a youth to go find another adult for some reason or another, they should be able to answer the question, where is this child? And you can say so. When it's a non-classroom activity, though, unless it's under the exceptions, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, at least 2 adults will have to be present for any non-classroom activities. That includes youth group, because it's technically not a classroom activity. That includes lock-ins, fun nights. That includes trips and retreats, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So there's this difference between classroom versus non-classroom activities, but for the most part, do your utmost best to have 2 adults, with each group supervising each group. And if there has to be only 1 adult for one reason or another, other adults are in the area and made aware there's only 1 adult in that room. When it comes to restrooms, this is not in the child protection policy, but I thought it was fitting to put it here. This is the guideline that I've been using for a couple years, and it seems to be working. It was also in a child protection policy of another church I'd worked at. When it comes to adults with groups who need the restroom, let's say you are leading a group with another adult, a VBS group, you're a shepherd with a VBS group, and between station rotations, you decide to take the group to the restroom. The best practice is to have 1 adult standing at each restroom door with the door open. So not only can the adults be visible to one another from the other restroom door, but they have 1 foot in the restroom so they can keep an eye on the children in the stalls. But everybody's being watched without being in a compromising position. But with younger children who need assistance, the door must remain open for the restroom while helping. So let's go ahead and move on to page 3. We're still kind of on the 2 adult rule. These are the exceptions for having 2 adults. One is when there's youth counseling. So circumstances might dictate that there must be a one-on-one kind of discussion with a church staff person or a volunteer. But before that happens, parents must be aware and give consent before any counseling does happen. Exceptions would be if there's an emergency, those kind of things. The other exception then is if there's a dismissal from group events. So if it may be inevitable that one child or youth transportation from an event arrives after all the other children have left. So let's say they're at youth group and I have one middle schooler whose mom's running late from work to pick him up or something like that. But everybody else is left. Because this is something that may be unavoidable, the general rule requires the presence of 2 adults. If there's no 2 adults, the adult is responsible for exercising best judgment for the child or youth's well-being. For the most part, I usually say in view of windows and doors, I usually have a second adult with me, so I'm not really part of this exception. But if I happen to be, I just tend to say near doors and windows, visible to the outside, to the public, to whoever else is in the building, and we just continue talking. I never go behind closed doors with that student while waiting for him to be picked up or her to be picked up. Third exception, multi-church events. All volunteers from other churches who are helping supervise the events, they must be under compliance with a similar child protection policy to ours or to our own. I usually look for the 2 adult rule, the prevention procedure, and usually the whole co-ed gender rules. And those are kind of the 3 things I look out for when looking at multi-church events. When it comes to public meetings, 1 adult is sufficient if the meeting is in public and parental consent is obtained. However, things change a little bit when it comes to trips and off-campus events. So at least 2 adults must be present for all the trips that are taken. I would say 3 are preferable in case an adult needs to take a kid for emergency or is sick or whatever it may be. I also prefer the ratio of 1 adult to 10 kids for anything that's on or off campus, because that allows everybody to have equal authority when it comes to extra eyes, hands, and ears to our group. At least 1 adult of each gender needs to be present when it comes to co-ed overnight events. If it's a single gender overnight, let's say it's like a girls' lock-in or something, at least 2 of the same gender must be present, and no adult should stay in the room overnight with children unless a second adult of the same gender can do so as well. And again, that makes it obvious that that room is only one gender as well with the kids. Okay, moving on to page 4. We're still talking about overnight or off-campus events. When it comes to traveling, you must have permission slips, and only approved drivers of the church van or bus can drive it. And those approved drivers have to be 21 years old, licensed, and insured. And if a driver needs to go somewhere, like they're running an errand for the group, like picking up more groceries for the mission trip or something, that driver must be accompanied by at least 2 children and youth. It can't just be 1 child and 1 adult. A couple other things to note: the open door policy, which is there kind of toward the top middle of page 4. Parents, volunteers, and staff of the church can visit and observe any children and youth program at any time. We want to make sure that that is something that as a parent, you're welcome at any time. Fair warning, if you happen to exercise open door policy at youth group, I will probably put you to work, but you're still welcome to come. And one final thing before we get into our response procedure, on the bottom of page 5, the education of persons who work with children and youth, it just states that we're going to start continuing to apply recommended trainings for those who are working with children and youth periodically throughout the year. I also would note that the renewal of the compliance forms will be every 2 years, and then to state this officially, that all records of 2019 training and beyond are not only going to be kept secure and confidential, but they are church property. They don't leave whenever the director leaves or when the pastor leaves. They stay here. They are church property. So now we're kind of going between page 4 to page 5, and we're talking about the allegation response procedure. So let's go through the whole complete thing, and then I'm going to briefly walk you through what your role is as a volunteer is. But let's go through the whole procedure so you could see where you fit in and where other people fit into this procedure. So if an allegation comes forward, if a child comes to you and says, this happened, the first thing to do is to immediately notify the proper authorities and to assure the safety of the child, and then to notify the parents of that child. So first of all, notifying the proper authorities. They are to head the investigation. You are just to report it and take care of the child until they get there. Okay. If the abuse is from home, like if a child came to me at youth group and said, this is what's happening at home, I am to follow the instructions of the police before I notify the parents. That's the only exception to me not notifying the parents right away. The other thing is, if someone comes to me or to you with an allegation, the first thing you also need to do then is remove the child to a safe environment. I'd also put there, it still needs to comply with our guidelines when you're with a child. It is your job to take all allegations seriously, and then with pastoral support, reach out to them and their family as they go through this time of investigation and questioning and hurt and healing. So take it seriously, and help provide pastoral support. The next part then is to report the incident to the senior pastor. The only time you report it to the SPR chair is if the allegation was against the senior pastor. But it's their role to contact the church's legal counsel, insurance company, and district superintendent, and they can find those procedures laid out in the book of discipline. The next step then is to keep a written report, an IRF, in church records, and to give detailed reports to the proper authorities, with confidentiality. So you give these reports, you write the IRF, you give the church records, and you never talk about it again. You don't gossip about it, you don't share it with your friends, you don't talk about it with the media, etc. It is confidential. It is then the church's next step to remove those persons who are accused from further involvement in the ministry with children and youth, but with compassion, dignity, and respect. It is then a pastor or other authority can tell the accused that allegation has been made. And then the last step is just kind of another note. Again, you write that report, you give detailed reports to the proper authorities, but it's only a pastor or district superintendent who can represent the church through the media. So, of course, the child protection policy goes into further detail. That was just a summary of the whole procedure when there is an allegation brought forward. But let's talk about your responsibility, steps to follow in case of an incident, an allegation. So there's only 5 steps. 1 is to call the proper authorities, police and medical if needed. 2, if you are on church campus or a church-sponsored event, remove the child to a safe environment until the authorities and parents arrive. And remember that special exception if the abuse is from home, what you do there. 3rd, you report to the senior pastor or the SPR chair so they can begin taking the appropriate steps with the district legal and insurance contacts. Then you take an IRF and fill it out completely and fully as soon as possible. And with that, you're also making reports to the proper authorities. Do that first. And then step 5 is to follow any further instructions that come from the police. But you also never speak of the incident outside of these people, outside of your IRF and talking to the police. Simple 5 steps: call the authorities, remove child, contact parents, contact the pastor, make your reports, and then follow any further instructions that the pastor or the police would have for you. Again, it's something hard we have to talk about. It's something that is a prevalent issue with humanity, this hurting of children and youth, but it is a necessary topic to have when we are dealing with families. So I wanted to present a incomplete, but the start of a list for further resources for those of you who feel led to A, gain more insight on the seriousness of this issue, or B, to discuss how the church and the family can continue to present this issue in the light of the gospel, and to keep an eye out for incidents that may occur with children or youth. So we have some books that decrease in level of reading as you go down. God Made All of Me, I would highly recommend, especially if this is a subject you want to broach with your own children. There are several articles that not only talk about abuse within the church and outside of the church, collaborating with children's social services, but also how to begin that conversation with your children or even your teen. And then last is an infographic that I think is a good introduction to that book, God Made All of Me. Thank you for completing the last of our training presentation videos. Be sure to review those presentations before you take the online quiz that is found on the church website. Remember that the deadline for the quiz and physical copies completed of all the forms to my office is February 16th, 2019. If you need help getting those physical copies, you'll find them at the church, or you can fill out the PDF and print them off at home. And I will see you all at the annual gathering. Thank you again for dedicating your time and your gifts and your heart to serving the families of our congregation. Hello and welcome to presentation 3.